I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we are going to be looking at the Oscar sweep of The English Patient in the 1996 Oscars. The Best Picture winner, I actually think, is the most forgotten movie. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is pick a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that I believe to be forgotten to time. A movie that isn't as well appreciated as some of the other movies, a movie that isn't necessarily in the cultural lexicon, that doesn't have a cult fan base and people rewatching it all the time, and just really hasn't held up maybe in the way that we want to. And sometimes the movies actually do hold up and they're great movies, sometimes maybe they've fallen away for a reason. We try to explore that in each of these episodes. But the show is essentially broken down into three parts. The first part being the historical context. I think it's very important to understand where sort of the culture was at the time, where the Academy was at the time, and why a movie was nominated versus something else. So we're going to be covering the 1996 Oscars. Then the second part is giving my thoughts on the movie, because for many of these movies, I hadn't even seen them before, so giving my sort of initial reactions, I think is also a valuable process. And then trying to answer that age-old question as to why this movie was forgotten and not some of the others. And once again, I've decided to cover a Best Picture winner here on this season of Forgotten Oscar Films. We'd already done Chicago, and we'd also done Crash, so sort of the early 2000s there. But for all intents and purposes, most Best Picture winners, particularly within film fans, are known for, at the very least, that there are certain movies that we've covered during the series that I think have been sort of completely forgotten, or movies that I hadn't even heard of. But with the Best Picture winners, in this case as well, with The English Patient, you've always heard of it. However, The English Patient, I think, is an interesting sort of period in history. I mean, this is the 96 Oscars, and the 90s, for as much as they were sort of known for being a birth of independent movies, with so many great directors really getting their start there, and the rise of DVDs and VHSs allowing sort of smaller, more interesting movies to be made. It was also known for, particularly the Oscars were known for having these sort of large-scale sweeps where one movie would win a bunch of awards. And the movies that did win the awards had to feel epic. They had to feel big, they had to feel large. That meant long run times, that meant usually a period setting. Of course, we talked about last week with Titanic winning a record-tying 11 Oscars, the highest highest amount of Oscars a movie has ever won. And just a year before here with The English Patient, it actually won 9 Oscars, so it was a huge hit at the Oscars as well. But in many ways, I think Titanic is a movie that's well remembered. Next week, we're going to be talking about the 1995 Oscars, which was the Braveheart Oscars, which didn't have a sort of a grand scale sweep like this, but is still sort of a long sort of historical movie. So it does sort of fit into this vein, I think. But for the most part, the Oscars are pretty good in terms of recognizing what movies will be classics, in the sense that they knew kind of Lord of the Rings would be something that would withstand. Of course, there's a new TV show coming out, has a loyal fan base, and that movie got a bunch of awards. Even Titanic, I mean, that was a big deal at the time because it was the highest grossing movie of all time, and it was a big deal at the culture. And you would even go further back with Lawrence of Arabia or Ben-Hur, when they do sort of award like these sort of grand scale sweeps, the way we don't really see nowadays. But when they did do it, it was a pretty good sort of track record. They never really gave it to certain movies that aren't as popular, except in the sort of this odd period of the 90s. Because I think of The English Patient, I think of it like Dances with Wolves. I think of it like The Last Emperor in a certain regard. Or even you could say Legends of the Fall was a sort of another branch of this. And they all have sort of their own unique kind of fan bases. But The English Patient, I think, is the most muted of the bunch, in the sense that I was surprised, even though I'm a bit of an Oscar aficionado, I was surprised going back and realizing that this had actually won 9 Oscars. That I knew it was a big deal, and it was a sweep at the Academy Awards. But what's so interesting about this year more than others is that it really is an Oscars hit. I mean, Titanic would have been a huge cultural moment because it made so much money at the box office, regardless of how many Oscars it won. But The English Patient was unique in the sense that it hadn't made any money really before it won Best Picture or was nominated for all these movies. That it was really sort of a movie that resonated with the Academy at the time. And I think maybe in one part is the reason why it's forgotten, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I chose this movie in part because it's a Best Picture nominee. Yes, you've maybe heard of it. Maybe there's another movie that's a little bit more forgotten. But I think out of this group, it probably is sort of the one that a lot of people maybe know about, a lot of people have heard of, but not necessarily everyone has seen. Or maybe you fake to say, you maybe say you've seen it, even though you haven't, because you want to seem sort of smart and sophisticated. It does seem sort of those well-respected, but not necessarily beloved kind of a movie. And this was also a really interesting year. I mean, for this movie, which feels very old-fashioned and classical, and it was sort of similar to an epic kind of 60s movie, the other nominees were actually, I think, really progressive and interesting and actually represented the future rather than looking at the past, which is maybe why this is a little bit more of a frustrating win, because my personal probably Best Picture winner that year will go to Fargo, which was another Best Picture nominee. And I think really, as well as representing the future, the movies that did get nominated, aside from The English Patient, were all from directors who sort of had their big break in the sense of they're really into Hollywood now. This is really, it wasn't any of the director's first film, but it was, I would say, a signature film for all of them. So the Coen brothers, of course, they had Raising Arizona and were well respected for Barton Fink even. But this was sort of the movie that put them, I think, on the map in the sense that, okay, these guys are serious filmmakers, they're Hollywood filmmakers, they're well respected, you know, they deserve their movies to be an event. So I think Fargo was really the defining moment of that. And of course, the movie is still well beloved, the Coen brothers, it has a TV show, so, you know, Fargo is not a forgotten movie and a bona fide film classic at this point. We also have Cameron Crowe's Jerry Maguire. This was very much a introduction of Cameron Crowe as a great sort of writer-director within that kind of late period of the 90s, and his career hasn't necessarily gone the way that people necessarily thought it would, but he still has, you know, classics like Jerry Maguire, like Almost Famous, that are still rewatched. You know, Jerry Maguire is a signature sort of rom-com, but it's also a signature sports movie. It's also a signature Tom Cruise performance. It has quotable lines that you'll see in montages. It's a well-remembered movie. Of course, it's also well-remembered because it's connected back to Cameron Crowe, this being sort of his big debut kind of a feature, even though it wasn't his first feature. And then another Best Picture nominee this year was Secret and Lies from Mike Leigh, who was another director who had a couple of earlier movies, and then this one I think really sort of broke out and put him into the sort of social realist alongside Ken Loach, and really made him a sort of really interesting and emerging British writer-director, and still has sort of a loyal fan base and will show up with movies like Mr. Turner and Topsy Turvy. I mean, he has sort of had these continual successes. I mean, he's been nominated for 7 Oscars, so he is a guy who's still sort of continued to be in the Oscar conversation and is still sort of a well-respected director. So, and Secret and Lies, I could argue, is maybe his best film. So I wouldn't say that's forgotten either. If we're making sort of a huge argument, you could say something like Shine would be a movie that's the most forgotten. But I would actually argue that the amount of people that have seen The English Patient versus the amount of people that have seen Shine are actually about the same. Because The English Patient is seen as maybe sort of a respected movie, but not necessarily a beloved movie in the sense that, like I said, people rewatch it, or that's people's favorite movies of all time. It does seem like a lot of people, I'm sure, have heard of The English Patient, as had I, but, you know, I consider myself a big film fan, and I never felt whatever sort of compelled to watch The English Patient at any point, aside from its sort of historical importance. There wasn't anyone necessarily saying this is the greatest movie of all time, it deserves a retrospective. It was sort of just appreciated and responded to as, oh, this was an important movie, a well-respected movie, not necessarily a beloved movie. So I wanted to cover that because this historical moment is so interesting, because The English Patient, I don't think, has sort of withstood sort of the cultural importance in terms of Fargo as a movie that, you know, I made a TV show about it because it's so well beloved. Cameron Crowe has an interesting career that people will write about and do podcasts about, but English Patient seems to be like a movie that was well respected at the time, but only by the Academy. So it's this really interesting historical moment where the Academy has almost put an emphasis of importance onto this movie rather than it earning within itself. Even at the time, it wasn't this huge box office movie that deserved, appreciation. It was a movie that was almost manufactured in that sense. Now, transitioning to my thoughts on the movie, I feel like that's a little bit too hard of a thing to put on the movie, because of course with all of these movies, they never ask to be nominated for Best Picture or to win Best Picture. They just try to make the best movie they can, and if it resonates, it resonates. And clearly this one did within the Academy. there's clear comparisons you can make to sort of the epics of the 60s, particularly something like Lawrence of Arabia in a similar time period in World War II, during the desert and this, in, North Africa and then into Italy. There is sort of a geographic kind of similarities to the two movies. Of course, they're also epic in scale in the sense that they're about period pieces and they're long and they're about romance. Well, Lawrence of Arabia isn't about romance, but they're sort of about epics that try to tackle sort of universal human themes, and I think that's what The English Patient does best when it does work best. I mean, it's a beautiful movie. It does feel very classical, and when it's great, it feels like some of those great movies, like a Casablanca or Lawrence of Arabia. But it is a strange movie in the sense that it was made in the 90s, that it was a movie that, while I was watching it, felt not as epic as necessarily a Lawrence of Arabia or even a Casablanca, even though it's not as epic. While the passion was very high within the movie, I don't feel like it was able to sustain it for this sort of 2 hour and 45-minute movie. And in many parts, it's kind of like this movie in two parts. It's about, for the most part, it's about a burn victim sort of retelling his past as it's coming to him after he suffered sort of a fatal event and realizing what his life had become and sort of the tragedy behind that. And most of the movie is set during the sort of flashbacks, recreations within the desert, him sort of recalling those moments as we see them. But then there's also, a large portion of the movie where we see Juliette Binoche's character. She actually won for Best Supporting Actress, and sort of her romance with the Sikh man and kind of the World War II sort of corollaries and that kind of a storyline. So there's sort of these two dueling elements. One so that I think works more than the other, so it's kind of a conflicted movie in the sense that I did really appreciate kind of the passion and the intensity of the Ralph Fiennes and Kristen Scott Thomas's characters. However, I didn't really feel this sort of, when we're going back to the recalling of those moments, these scenes to be lasted so long, that there's so many characters in that element that neither of them sort of really develop, that the romance between the Sikh man and Juliette Binoche doesn't get enough sort of appreciation and time to it. And I think it's maybe a victim of being an adaptation of a book, which in a book you can do so much. You can have these sort of dueling storylines going on at once. But what's so great about a movie like Casablanca or Lawrence of Arabia is in the sense that Lawrence of Arabia is an epic movie about great larger themes and has these grand vistas, but ultimately it's about a man. It's a character study at the center of it. And this movie, ultimately it's a romance at the center of it. But we don't get as much of a romance, I think, as maybe we deserve, that feels earned and rewarding by the end, because we spend so much time doing other things that we don't actually get enough time in this. So that this is actually probably a good 2.5 hour movie about just one thing, but we need more development in that. So because of that, I felt like the movie at times really sort of drags along. It doesn't engage you in the same way some of the great other classics do. I mean, it's not the problem that the movie is 3 hours long. I mean, there's plenty of movies that really grip you, engage you, even though they're 3 hours long. But this one doesn't feel, it feels the need to be epic, where rather the story I don't think necessarily even deserves that. That the story is not best served at being this sort of great long 2 hour and 45-minute movie that is sort of like this grand achievement. You could make that kind of a movie, but it is sort of split in between being one story and then another story. They don't really sort of merge together, I felt, very well. And maybe this, I could realize this is a movie that's a little bit maybe too adult for me, or sophisticated or serious, or maybe just a little bit too traditional for my liking. But it does feel like a movie that, 96 should feel a little bit more modern, and of course it's looking back at those movies, but doesn't necessarily accomplish the success of those movies and what they're able to do. So unfortunately, while the passion was there, I didn't feel that romance sort of as a central theme, and because it was a little bit too long, it was draggy in some parts. I did sort of zone out at a couple moments, and ultimately I wouldn't sort of consider this movie necessarily a successful movie in that regard, despite many of the great elements and craftsmanship within it. But now trying to understand why this movie is forgotten, one part I think is maybe a lot of people have the same reaction to me. I hadn't really seen any sort of retrospectives or people acclaiming this movie, that if you go on a site like Letterboxd, for the most part it's sort of negative to maybe, a couple of glowing reviews, but mostly sort of middling to negative, that it doesn't have sort of an underappreciated classic element to it, even though many people want that to necessarily exist. It's a strange moment in history, I think, because it's one of these strange moments where the Academy has placed importance onto a movie that the movie, like I said, didn't necessarily earn it within critical reviews or even the box office at the time, but it was this specific group of sort of Hollywood people that the movie really resonated to, and they loved it, and they got all these nominations, and they gave it 9 Oscars, and they really fell in love with it. But the truth is, it's a movie that's harkening back to sort of an epic period of Hollywood, where epics were sort of the big, grand moment. And that's an era that not as many people in the general public appreciate or understand. And this movie, it's a period that I like, but when the movie, I feel like, is harkening back to it, but not necessarily doing it as successfully, it feels a little bit of an imitation. It feels like an unsuccessful movie. And just because it's harkening back to that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be successful in that. So that's one part, but also the era that it's harkening back to, even if it was a successful movie, I just don't think is as popular with certain people. Some people have seen Lawrence of Arabia, serious film fans, but I don't think, the younger generation today has as much appreciation as maybe the Academy did at the time for these kinds of movies. So this type of movie feels sort of traditional, whereas the movies of the 90s that felt sort of interesting and dark and unexpected, like a Pulp Fiction or a Fight Club or a Fargo. I mean, these are the movies that felt interesting at the time and have sort of aged really well, where the movies that always sort of harken back are oftentimes sort of left to the curb, whether rightly or wrongly, whether you think the movie is really great or not. That's kind of the trend that I've seen throughout these years. I think The English Patient is a prime example of that. So as a sort of strange subgenre of a movie that gets all its Oscar love and serious sophistication almost placed upon it by the Academy, this and even something like Legends of the Fall or Dances with Wolves, although I do like those movies a little bit better, they do fit into that sort of similar movie where it's supposed to seem important, so the Academy places importance on it by awarding all these Oscars, yet it still becomes forgotten in the future, because ultimately it's the movie that matters. Ultimately, it's the actual product itself. And if it's a movie that's not as well appreciated, it's going to be forgotten. And I think that's the unfortunate situation with The English Patient, that it's got its praise at the time, but it is one of those movies that is well respected more than it is beloved. It is one of those movies that you have to watch for historical importance. It's not a movie that necessarily people are clamoring you to see. I don't think it's any of the lead's best performance. I don't even think it's Anthony Minghella's best movie. So it's kind of in this awkward situation that I think has led it to be forgotten. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on The English Patient. Maybe I'm a little bit more negative on this one than others. Maybe you really love it. Maybe this is your favorite Oscar year of all time. It's an interesting year in the sense that we have all these emerging filmmakers, Cameron Crowe and the Coen brothers and Mike Leigh. So it is an interesting year in that regard. And please let me know in the comments down below what kinds of movies you want to see in the upcoming episodes. We've got about less than 10 before we actually start up back with the old Oscar Countdown series. We'll start once again in the fall, so that'll be a lot of fun. But until next time, stay tuned.